Of course, reasonable men will disagree in their judgments, but I suspect they will converge on a common point. Namely, that the system we have isn't functioning in the way we think it is. In fact, it is not building up the world, but tearing it down. And as such, it is not sustainable. That is, it doesn't really work, not for most people and not for any appreciable length of time. Now, what can't continue won't. And since it won't continue, it will have to be rebuilt, and rebuilt from the ground up. Let me suggest that that puts a particular burden on the people in this room. You are the ones who will have the task of rebuilding the world. Every age has a different set of what Alistair MacIntyre calls decisive professions. In some ages it is the warrior, in some ages it is the priest or philosopher. But ours is a commercial age. And in a commercial age, it is the commercial professions which are decisive in building the world. You are the future practitioners and current practitioners of these critical professions. The burden of change will therefore fall on your shoulders. This is not really a task you can refuse. The task will come crashing over you like a wave, and you will not be able to avoid it. You really have no choice in the matter. But where you do have a choice is the kind of world that gets built. Here then is the arena for both true freedom and creative talent. Here you can exercise moral choice and professional skill. However, this requires another fundamental decision, namely that you see your job not as a job at all, but as a calling, a vocation. Your work must not be merely a way of getting and spending, but it must be a true gift, funded, no doubt, by all the laws of contract and exchange, but it cannot be reducible to those laws. In the end, it must represent a pure gift, first to yourself, then to your family, your city, your nation, and to the world. At the last trumpet, on the last day, this is all you will be allowed to take with you. This is what you will present to the master, to the just judge, and say, this is what I have done. And that is what will be weighed in the balance. Two decisions, I believe, will have to be made. One is on the way economies actually work, and the other on the way businesses actually work. And both of these, I think, reduce to the same decision, namely, whether justice is really the principle that guides all social relationships. Let us begin by looking at justice in economics. Now, most of us work in a more or less capitalist system, but this system has at its core a particular conundrum, one noted by G.K. Chesterton when he wrote, "Capitalism is contradictory as soon as it is complete, because it is dealing with the mass of men in two opposite ways at once. When most men are wage earners, it is more and more difficult for most men to be customers. For the capitalist is always trying to cut down what his servant demands, and in doing so, is cutting down what his customer can spend. He is wanting the same man to be rich and poor at the same time." The victory of capitalism is now complete. Hence, we are not surprised to see that it is in crisis, one that may be terminal. One sign of the completeness of capitalism is the fact that income inequality has now reached the same level it was in 1929. the date of the last great crisis and the beginning of many great changes, for better or worse. This, I believe, illustrates the truth of Chesterton's insight. The capitalist has succeeded in suppressing the wages of his worker and hence has suppressed demand for his products. Let me cite some key numbers from the American economy, numbers that bear on this problem of demand. The median wage for the white male worker has been flat since 1973. Yet productivity in the same period has exploded in all categories of labor. Thus, the worker is expected to buy a much larger amount of goods with the same wage he had 40 years ago. This is an impossibility. At first, the response was to put more family members to work, thus increasing the family take in the face of stagnant wages. This worked for a while, but it had questionable impact on family life in America. But whatever its impact, the family wage in the United States has stagnated for a dozen years. So the next solution was simply to lend the wage earners the money they needed to clear the markets at rates that routinely reached 30% or more. Clearly, this is only a short-term strategy, since demand that is increased by a borrowed dollar today must be decreased by that same dollar in a future period, plus interest. Now, is the stagnation of wages connected to our economic failures? The economists give this very little attention. But then, recessions, both major and minor, occur at fairly regular intervals and have fairly regular features. Yet the economists are never able to predict them. The experts are as surprised as the amateurs by these events. 90% of the economists fail to predict the coming of this disaster and the one before that and the one before that, etc. If your doctor had the same track record as your economist, you'd be dead. The inevitable conclusion is that economics is an incomplete science. What is missing? To answer this question, we must go back to the birth of economics in the 19th century. The study of political economy is as old as Aristotle, but the philosopher discussed the subject within the context of his politics and ethics. Right up to the time of Adam Smith, himself a professor of moral theology, political economy was a colony of ethics. But the 19th century utilitarians were embarrassed by this connection with morality. They believed that in order for political economy to be a real science, it had to be divorced from ethics, just like physics. As one wit put it, they suffered from physics envy. Well, somebody got it. And so the science of political economy was split into the subdisciplines of politics and economics. Justice and other value-laden topics would be confined to the first, while economics would be value-free, like all the other real sciences. As a sign of this change in attitude, we can note that Adam Smith used the term justice 100 times in The Wealth of Nations. But Alfred Marshall, in 1891, the chief founder of the new science, used it only 4 times in his text, and Stanley Jevons, another founder, used it only once, and that to deny that it should be used at all. The fallacy, of course, is that economics is not at all like physical science. It is a humane science. Like all humane sciences, it deals with a certain class of human relationships. That is, those human relationships that are necessary for the material provisioning of society. And human relationships are properly regulated by justice, not solely as a moral matter, but as a practical scientific question. Nor can the question be avoided. Whatever system a society adopts, it will reflect a certain view of the moral order. Statements such as survival of the fittest, or greed is good, or labor is just another commodity, are just as much moral statements as are a statement like you must pay a just wage. Politics and economics received their final divorce decree in 1891 with the publication of Marshall's The Principles of Economics. But within 6 months, a certain Bishop of Rome, Leo XIII, published Rerum Novarum, in which he proclaimed the necessity of paying a just wage, and thereby married the ethical term to the economic term. What God hath joined together, let no man tear asunder. But did God, or nature if you prefer, really join these two terms? If an economy is to achieve equilibrium, that rough balance between supply and demand upon which all orderly markets depend, then there must be sufficient demand distributed through the mass of men to clear the markets. Since most men do not have sufficient productive property, most goods will have to be distributed through wages. And for this to work, there must be a certain justice in the wage. If the workers get a declining share of the output, markets will fail. There will not be enough purchasing power to clear the markets, and they will have to be supplemented by government spending or consumer lending. But both of these are temporary fixes at best, which merely delay the collapse rather than mend it. Wages are a part of distributive justice, which deals with how to distribute the output of some social enterprise, be it a state, a firm, or a family. But distributive justice had a distinct problem in the eyes of the new scientists. Namely, it cannot be precisely calculated. One could make a judgment about how to value the contribution of each person to the production process. But as Aristotle pointed out, the judgment will vary from culture to culture. Oligarchies would vary contributions in one way, democracies would value it in another way. Such culturally embedded judgments were anathema to the new scientists, who wished to establish a universal system valid across all cultures. The only way to accomplish that was to treat labor not as the source of all human values and the prime determinant of final demand, but as a commodity whose price could be determined just as is any other commodity. But this turns out to be circular. Since the price for any commodity is determined by demand, and demand is determined by the distribution of incomes, it is equivalent to saying that demand is determined by demand.